I'm trying to remind the manual therapists in the audience, maybe the manual therapy students, because as we said before, um, there is somewhat of a, I don't want to call it a backlash, but a resistance as of late as to not only the effectiveness of soft tissue therapy itself, but as we're going to get into the effectiveness of our outcome measures leading to the desire to apply soft tissue therapy. So again, fibrosis is real. I think just on the outset, we're not saying that movement itself does not often lead to reorganization of said connective tissue, but we are saying that repeated strains, repeated loads that with insufficient time for healing to occur, chronic tissue strain, even acute tissue strain, oftentimes the healing process, at the end of the healing process, you are left with, with tissue that is more optimal than it was, when the injury occurred, but less
Right.
optimal than it was prior to any of this occurring, meaning that, as I often say, all injuries come with anatomical consequences, and it isn't the job of the body to repair those anatomical consequences back to the way it was before. Rather, the evolutionary process is such that we evolve to mend the problem as best as we can in order to immediately restore function, which,
Right.
as we know, might immediately restore function, but cumulatively over time, when you start to accumulate more and more of this fibrotic development, very quickly things that weren't dysfunctional can become dysfunctional very rapidly.
Right. And this is why sometimes we get re-injuries into areas that already have been injured. So,
Very good
um,
example. As we often say, the first injury you're going to sustain after rolling, inversion, a sprain of your ankle is going to be an inversion sprain of the exact same ankle. So again,
correct.
there's lasting findings. Now, maybe this is how we tie in as you were trying to do earlier. So let's tie this in now to the outcome measure that is palpation. Um,
Right.
and now we're talking um, about our ability, so to speak, to identify these aberrant tissues, but maybe we should step back first in terms of palpation and maybe define it in the way that we do when we teach it, whereby there's two main um, conceptual frameworks in which we palpate. One being the framework of identification, which is, of course, our ability to isolate anatomical structure. And then
Mhm.
two being the interpretation, whereby we can take um, sensory perception when palpating anatomical structure and translate it into um, clinical decision making regarding diagnosis, regarding what's going on in the tissue itself, and how do we then apply forces. So there's identification,
Right.
interpretation. So maybe we can start with one and then move to the other.
Right. And I think identification should come first. I mean, eh, I guess the way we should look at it is that when you look when you look at a human system, right, and you look at things that we engage in with as manual therapists, there's a couple of tissues that we're really looking at. So there's a couple of target tissues that we really want to assess or that we assess as manual therapists. So there's muscular tissue, so there's the red stuff, so muscular tissue, and then there's tissue that we call connective tissue. And so both of these tissues have to kind of work together to generate whatever they need to generate from a movement perspective. Uh, Specifically, what we want to do is we want to tease these two things apart because they kind of work in conjunction. And in order to better understand what each tissue does on its own, we need to be able to tease these things two out. So I'm not saying that we're able to palpate or differentiate connective tissue from muscular tissue. But part of our assessment using palpation is being able to create stress conditions onto these tissues. And we do this using length in order to be able to differentiate between an outcome measure for white stuff or connective tissue and red stuff, which is muscular tissue.
Excellent.
So we're using palpation to do this. And I might even, when it comes to identification, I would even take it a step further back, and I would go back to touch as far as palpation goes, and what we know about touch, because I think that's where we should start. Is how is touch represented in our cortex? So what the cortical representation of touch is in our sensory cortex. And if you take a look at touch and the representation of touch in our cortex, for our hands, it's probably 100 times more than it is for, let's say, our back. For those of the people that are listening to us and watching us, if you go back to our neurology and we think about the sensory homunculus, which was that little short guy with the big hands and the big feet, there was a reason why it was depicted in this way. It's because in our sensory cortex, those parts of our body, so our lips, our hands, our feet, have a lot of receptors. And so we need to understand that, and we need to understand that these areas of our body have a lot more receptors than other parts of the body. So that's going to give us an advantage as far as being able to train this as a skill in order to improve it and be able to use it when it comes to palpation.